Snow fell heavily outside. The living room was filled with the sound of clinking bottles and raucous laughter. Derek and his friends were huddled around a small battered table, the air thick with the scent of alcohol and stale smoke. It was a typical winter evening in their frigid city. But the chill inside the apartment was not just from the cold outside. Julie moved quietly through the room, her movements hurried and anxious. She avoided Derek's gaze, keeping her head down as she tidied up the mess left by his friends. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of her fear and unease. Derek, her half-brother, had been drinking heavily, and she knew how quickly his mood could turn dark. "Julie," Derek's voice boomed across the room, causing her to flinch. "Get over here and make us something to eat." Julie froze for a moment, her back to Derek. She took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to refuse. She knew that standing up to him would have consequences, but she couldn't keep bending to his will. "I'm busy, Derek," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to finish cleaning up." Derek's face twisted in anger. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair, which clattered loudly on the floor. His friends fell silent, sensing the impending conflict. "Busy," Derek snarled, taking a step towards her. "You're always too busy, aren't you? Too busy to do anything I ask." Julie took a step back, her hands trembling. She could feel the heat of Derek's anger radiating towards her. I need to go to my room," she stammered, turning to leave. Before she could take another step, Derek grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "You're not going anywhere until you do what I say," he growled. The room was silent, all eyes on the siblings. Julie's heart raced as she tried to pull away, but Derek's grip was too strong. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, Derek, let me go," she begged. Derek's face contorted with fury. "You think you can just ignore me? Think you're better than me?" he shouted. His friends watched with a mix of amusement and discomfort, none of them daring to intervene. "I don't think that," Julie whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just want to go to my room." Derek's anger reached a boiling point. With a shove, he pushed her towards the door. "Get out," he spat. "Get out of my house." Julie stumbled, barely catching herself before falling. She turned to look at Derek, her face a mask of shock and fear. "But it's freezing outside," she said, her voice trembling. Derek glared at her, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "I don't care. Get out and don't come back until you learn some respect." Derek dragged Julie across the living room, heading to the door. Julie looked around the room, hoping for some sign of compassion from Derek's friends. But they all avoided her gaze. "Derek, please," she begged, trying to get her hand out of Derek's. "Don't make me go out there." But Derek had already opened the door. The icy wind immediately cut through Julie's thin clothing. He shoved her to the ground and slammed the door. The cold biting into her skin, she hadn't even had a chance to take her coat. "Please, Derek. Please, let me in. I'll cook for you," Julie shouted while banging at the door, hoping Derek would change his mind. But the door remained closed and the sounds of laughter and clinking bottles resumed inside. Shivering, Julie wrapped her arms around herself and started to walk. The streets were empty, the snow crunching under her feet. She didn't know where she was going. The cold seeped into her bones and her breath came out in visible puffs of steam. She felt utterly alone, abandoned in the harsh winter night. As she walked, images of her mother Violet flooded her mind. Violet had always been the mediator, the one who kept peace between her and Derek. But now, when Violet was not around, there was no one to protect her from Derek's wrath. Julie felt a pang of longing for her mother, a deep ache that seemed to grow with each step she took. She wandered aimlessly through the streets, her mind a whirl of fear and desperation. She thought about the times when Derek had been kind when they had played together as children, but those memories seemed distant and unreal now, overshadowed by his cruelty and anger. Tears streamed down her face, freezing almost instantly in the frigid air. "Why, Derek?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "Why do you hate me so much?" The memory of that cold winter morning was still fresh in Julie's mind. It had been a month since Violet, her mother, had left to take care of Julie's ailing grandmother, leaving Julie and Derek to fend for themselves. It had started with a phone call. Violet had been in the kitchen, her face growing increasingly tense as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. When she hung up, There was a look of determination mixed with worry etched across her features. "Julie, I need to talk to you," Violet had said, her voice calm but firm. Julie had followed her mother into the living room, her heart already sinking. She had a feeling that whatever was coming next would not be good news. "Your grandmother has had a stroke," Violet explained, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She needs someone to take care of her, and I have to go." Julie had felt a wave of panic wash over her. "But Mom, you can't leave. What about me? What about Derek?" Her voice trembled. Violet had taken Julie's hands in her own, squeezing them gently. "I know it's not ideal, sweetheart, but your grandmother needs me right now. I promise I will come back as soon as I can." Julie had glanced towards Derek's room, where he had been holed up since the morning. "I don't want to stay here alone with Derek. He's always so scary." Violet sighed, her expression pained. "Julie, Derek is going through his own struggles. Try to be patient with him. And remember, you are stronger than you think. You'll manage until I get back." Just then, Derek had appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a look of indifference. "You're leaving again?" he had asked, his tone devoid of any real interest. "Yes, Derek. Your grandmother needs me," Violet had replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Derek had shrugged, his face impassive. "Whatever. Do what you have to do." Violet had turned back to Julie, her eyes softening. "Take care of yourself, okay? I'll be back before you know it." She had pulled Julie into a tight hug, holding on as if she could transfer some of her strength to her daughter. Julie had clung to her mother, her eyes filling with tears. "Please don't go," she had whispered, her voice cracking. Violet had pulled back, brushing a tear from Julie's cheek. "I have to, honey. But you'll be fine. Just keep your head down and stay out of trouble." With a final kiss on the forehead, Violet picked up her suitcase and walked out the door. Julie had watched her mother's figure grow smaller and smaller until she disappeared around the corner, leaving an overwhelming sense of dread in her wake. The days that followed had been filled with a suffocating silence. Derek had barely acknowledged Julie's presence, and when he did, it was with a cold detachment that made her feel even more isolated. She'd tried to keep herself busy with schoolwork and chores, anything to avoid thinking about how alone she felt. One evening, about a week after Violet had left, Julie had tried to talk to Derek. She had knocked on his bedroom door, hesitating before pushing it open. Derek had been sitting on his bed, staring blankly at the wall. "Derek, can we talk?" Julie had asked tentatively. Derek had looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he had asked flatly. I feel really alone," Julie had admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I miss Mom, and I don't know how to handle all of this." Derek sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I'm not Mom. I can't help you with your feelings or whatever. Leave me alone." Julie had felt a lump form in her throat. "Why are you like this, Derek? Why do you hate me so much?" "I said leave me alone," Derek said, as he shut the door. Julie walked away from his room, feeling more lost than ever. She had returned to her own room and sat on her bed, staring out at the falling snow, felt so empty. One particularly cold evening, Julie had decided to make dinner. She chose that maybe, just maybe, sharing a meal could bridge the gap between them. She had cooked a simple meal and set the table. When Derek returned home, the acrid scent of alcohol clung to him, a bitter reminder of the widening chasm between them. With a tentative smile, Julie invited him to join her for dinner. Derek's eyes scanned the table, but instead of softening, his expression hardened. In a sudden, violent motion, he swept the dishes to the floor, the clatter echoing through the room like shattered hopes. Without a word, he retreated to his room, leaving chaos in his wake. Julie remained at the table, her gaze fixed on the scattered remnants of her efforts. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, drawing on the inner strength her mother had always urged her to cultivate. She knew she had to be strong, despite the weight of her sorrow. The winter breeze pulled Julie back to reality. The snow blanketed the city in a thick white layer that muffled all sounds. Julie sat huddled on the steps of a house, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to preserve what little warmth she had. She wished for the warmth of her mother's embrace, for the comfort and safety that seemed like a distant memory now. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, her mind numb from the cold and the events that had led her here. Derek's angry words and the sound of the door slamming shut echoed in her ears. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, a light flickered on inside the house. The door creaked open and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the warm light inside. Tony, the kind-hearted neighbor, stepped out and saw Julie sitting there, shivering in the cold. "Julie," he called out, concern evident in his voice. "What are you doing out here? It's freezing." Julie looked up, her teeth chattering. I didn't have anywhere else to go," she managed to say, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Tony's brow furrowed in worry. "Come inside quickly," he said, reaching out a hand to help her up. "You can't stay out here in this weather." Julie took his hand gratefully, allowing him to pull her to her feet. Her legs felt weak and numb, but she managed to follow him inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her as Tony closed the door behind them. The contrast between the icy cold outside and the cozy warmth inside was almost overwhelming. Tony led her to the living room and helped her into a chair by the fireplace. "Sit here and warm up," he said, draping a blanket over her shoulders. "I'll get you something hot to drink." Julie nodded, her eyes wide with gratitude. She watched as Tony disappeared into the kitchen, her body slowly beginning to thaw out. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a comforting glow around the room. A few minutes later, Tony returned with a steaming mug of hot chocolate. He handed it to Julie, who wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a cautious sip. Tony sat down across from her, his expression gentle but serious. "Julie, what happened? Why were you out there all alone in the snow?" Julie took a deep breath, feeling a lump form in her throat. The events of the evening and the past month came rushing back, and she struggled to find the words. "It's Derek," she began, her voice trembling. He threw me out. I didn't know where else to go." Tony's eyes narrowed in concern. "Why would he do that? What happened?" Julie looked down at her mug, tears welling up in her eyes. "He's been different since Mum left to take care of Grandma. He's always been distant, but when Mum left, he was just angry all the time. Tonight, he was drinking with his friends, and when I wouldn't make them food, he got really mad. He dragged me out and wouldn't let me back in." Tony listened intently, his expression darkening with each word. "That's unacceptable," he said firmly. "You shouldn't have to go through that, especially from your own brother." Julie wiped at her tears, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. "I didn't know what to do. I was so scared and cold." Tony reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing by coming here. You're safe now, Julie. You can stay here as long as you need." Julie looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Tony. I didn't know who else to turn to." Tony gave her a comforting smile. "You don't need to thank me. It's what anyone decent would do. Now let's get you settled for the night. You need rest." He showed Julie to a small guest room, providing her with extra blankets and making sure she was comfortable. As she lay down, the events of the night still swirling in her mind, Julie felt a small measure of peace. She was safe, at least for now. The next morning, Tony knocked gently on the door before entering the room. "How are you feeling, Julie?" he asked. Julie sat up, feeling the weight of the previous night's exhaustion still clinging to her. "Better, thanks to you," Tony nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. I think we should talk about what to do next. You can't go back to that house with Derek. It's not safe." They spent the morning talking, Tony listening patiently as Julie recounted the events of the past month. She told him about her mother's departure, the growing hostility from Derek, and her feelings of isolation and fear. Tony offered words of comfort and support, assuring her that they would find a solution. As the day turned to evening, Julie felt a renewed sense of hope. The future was still uncertain, but she knew she had someone in her corner. Tony's kindness and willingness to help had lifted a heavy burden from her shoulders. She sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and feeling the warmth spread through her body. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that things might get better. She'd found an ally in Tony, and with his support, she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Getting better, Julie, determined to show her gratitude for Tony's kindness, had spent the morning helping him tidy up. She moved from room to room, dusting and organizing, feeling a sense of purpose that had eluded her in recent weeks. Tony was in the kitchen, washing dishes, his movements steady and unhurried. The sound of running water and the clinking of plates was a soothing background to the quiet of the apartment. Julie had just finished dusting a bookshelf when her hand brushed against something behind a row of books. She pulled out an old, slightly yellowed photograph. The photo depicted a young man with a strong jawline and kind eyes standing in front of a small house. On the back of the photo, an address was scrawled in faded ink. Julie's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the image, a sense of familiarity tugging at her memory. "Tony," she called, her voice tentative. "Can you come here for a second?" Tony dried his hands on a towel and walked over. "What's up, Julie?" She handed him the photograph. "I found this behind the books. Do you know who this is?" Tony took the photo and examined it closely. His eyes softened with recognition. "That's Mark," he said quietly, "an old friend from many years ago." Julie felt a surge of curiosity. "Do you know where he is now? The address on the back, is it still valid?" Tony looked at the address and sighed. "It was his address a long time ago. I haven't spoken to him in years." "Why do you ask?" Julie hesitated, her thoughts racing. I think he might be my father. My mom mentioned someone named Mark once, but she never told me much. Seeing this photo, it just feels like a piece of the puzzle." Tony's expression turned thoughtful. "Mark and I were close back then. If there's a chance he could be your father, it's worth finding out. But are you sure you want to do this? It might not be what you expect," Julie determined. "I have to know, Tony. I need to find out if he's my father. It might help me understand a lot of things about myself and my past." The drive to the city where Mark lived was long and filled with heavy silence. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the car windows, adding to the sense of surreal anticipation that Julie felt. Tony, ever the steady presence, focused on the road, glancing at Julie occasionally to ensure she was holding up. Julie clutched the photograph of Mark tightly in her hands, her mind racing with a mix of hope and fear. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times, but now, as they neared their destination, her confidence wavered. "Are you okay?" Tony asked gently, breaking the silence. Julie nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. "I'm just nervous. What if he doesn't want to see me?" Tony's expression softened. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Just remember, you have every right to seek these answers." They arrived at the address written on the back of the photograph. It was a modest, well-kept house in a quiet neighborhood. Julie took a deep breath as they parked and got out of the car. Her legs felt unsteady, and the cold air did little to calm her racing heart. As they approached the front door, it opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her gaze shifting between Julie and Tony. Julie cleared her throat, her voice shaking slightly. "Hi, I'm looking for Mark. Is he here?" The woman's smile faltered slightly. "Mark isn't home right now, but he should be back soon. Can I ask what this is about?" Julie exchanged a glance with Tony, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I'm Julie. I think Mark might be my father." The woman's eyes widened with surprise, but she quickly composed herself. "I see. Well, why don't you come in and wait for him? It's too cold to be standing out here." Julie and Tony followed her inside. They sat in silence, the ticking of a clock on the mantel, the only sound in the room. Julie's nerves were a tangled mess, each passing minute stretching her anticipation to its limits. Finally, the sound of the front door opening and closing echoed through the house. Sarah stood up and moved towards the hallway. "Mark, there's someone here to see you," she called out. A moment later, Mark appeared in the doorway, looking slightly confused. His eyes landed on Julie and Tony, and he frowned. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cautious. Julie stood up, her heart pounding. "Hi, Mark. My name's Julie. I think you might be my father." Mark's frown deepened, and he glanced at Sarah, who nodded reassuringly. "Julie, you said," he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Julie nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, my mother is Violet. She mentioned your name once, and when I found this photo," she held up the photograph. "I had to find out if you were my dad." Mark took the photo from her, his expression unreadable as he studied it. He looked up at Julie, his eyes narrowing. "I knew Violet, but I don't see how this concerns me." Julie's heart sank at his cold tone. "I just want to know the truth," she said quietly. "If you are my father, I have a right to know." Mark's gaze hardened. I don't know what Violet told you, but I'm not interested in getting involved. I have my own life. Tony stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Mark, she's not asking for much, just a conversation. Can't you at least give her that? Mark's expression remained stony. I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Please leave. Julie felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Mark, please, she whispered. I just want to understand where I come from. Mark shook his head. I'm sorry. I can't help you. Now, if you don't mind. Tony put a reassuring hand on Julie's shoulder. Let's go, Julie. Julie turned to leave, her heart heavy with disappointment. As they walked back to the car, she felt a sense of emptiness settles over her. The hope she had clung to so desperately seemed to dissipate with each step. Once inside the car, Tony looked at her with concern. Are you okay? Julie shook her head, tears finally spilling over. I wanted to know him, to understand. Tony sighed, starting the car. I'm sorry, Julie. Sometimes people can't face the past, no matter how much we want them to. Julie nodded, wiping her tears away. Thank you for being here with me, Tony. I don't know what I would have done without you. Tony smiled gently. You don't have to thank me, Julie. You're strong, and you'll get through this. As they drove away from Mark's house, Julie gazed out the window, watching the snowflakes dance in the air. She had sought answers and found rejection, but she also realized she wasn't alone. Tony's support and kindness were a beacon of hope, guiding her through the storm. The days had passed in a blur since the meeting with Mark. It was late afternoon, and Julie was sitting on the couch, absently flipping through a book. The sound of the phone ringing broke the silence. Julie picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. Hello? Hello, is this Julie? An unfamiliar voice asked. Yes, this is she. Who is this? Julie responded, her heart starting to race. This is Dr. Mitchell from the County General Hospital. I'm calling to inform you that your mother and grandmother were involved in a serious car accident. You need to come to the hospital immediately. Julie felt her world tilt. What? Are they okay? She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Please come to the hospital as soon as you can. We'll explain everything when you get here, Dr. Mitchell replied gently. Julie hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She turned to Tony, her face pale and stricken. Tony, we need to go to the hospital. Mom and Grandma were in an accident. Tony's expression turned serious. Let's go, he said, grabbing his coat and guiding Julie out the door. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Julie sat in the passenger seat, her mind racing with fear and worry. When they arrived at the hospital, a nurse led them to a small private room. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the harsh fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over everything. Julie's hands were clammy, and her legs felt weak. A doctor entered the room, his face solemn. Are you Julie? He asked gently. Julie nodded, barely able to find her voice. Yes. The doctor took a deep breath. I'm very sorry to inform you that your mother and grandmother were involved in a severe car accident. Despite our best efforts, they both succumbed to their injuries. The words hit Julie like a physical blow. She felt the room spin and her legs gave out. Tony was there in an instant, catching her and guiding her to a chair. No, Julie whispered, tears streaming down her face. This can't be happening. The doctor continued, his voice kind but firm. I know this is incredibly difficult to hear. If there's anything we can do to help, please let us know. Julie shook her head, her mind unable to process the reality of what she was hearing. They can't be gone, she sobbed. I didn't even get to say goodbye. Tony knelt beside her, his hand on her back, offering what comfort he could. Julie, I'm so sorry. We'll get through this together. Julie cried until she had no tears left, the pain and shock overwhelming her. Tony stayed by her side, his presence a steadying force amidst the chaos. After what felt like hours, they left the hospital and drove back to Tony's apartment in silence. Inside the apartment, Julie collapsed onto the couch, feeling utterly numb. Tony sat beside her, his expression filled with concern. Julie, I know this is unimaginably hard, Tony said softly, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out together. Julie looked at him through tear-filled eyes. How am I supposed to go on without them? Tony took a deep breath, his voice steady. You take it one day at a time. You lean on the people who care about you. And remember, your mother and grandmother would want you to be strong. Julie nodded, though the words felt hollow. I don't know if I can. Tony placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You can, and you will, and you won't have to do it alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. In the days that followed, Tony helped Julie navigate the overwhelming grief. He made sure she ate, rested, and took care of herself, even when she didn't have the strength to do so. He handled the arrangements for the funerals, shielding Julie from as much of the logistical burden as he could. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Tony spoke up. Julie, I've been thinking a lot about this. I want you to stay here with me. Julie looked at him, surprised. What do you mean? Tony gave her a reassuring smile. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I want to adopt you, Julie. I want to give you a stable home where you know you're loved and safe. Tears welled up in Julie's eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Tony, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Tony replied gently. Just know that you're not alone, and you have a place here with me. Julie nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope amidst her sorrow. The road ahead was uncertain and filled with pain, but with Tony by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She had lost so much, but in Tony, she had found a new family, and in that moment, she knew she could face whatever came next. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions for Julie. Living with Tony had given her a semblance of stability and comfort that she hadn't known in a long time. She was beginning to feel like she had a new family, one that genuinely cared for her well-being. But Derek's shadow loomed large, and the peace she found with Tony was about to be shattered. Julie had just finished dinner and was tidying up the kitchen when she heard a loud knock on the door. It was late, Tony was working a night shift and she wasn't expecting anyone. Opened the door, her stomach dropped when she saw Derek standing outside. Derek, what are you doing here? She asked, her voice trembling. I want to talk. Derek talked with a calm voice. Go with me. Though didn't want to go with Derek, Julie followed him. She didn't know why she did that. She has never seen Derek that calm and close. Man, he has changed, Julie thought to herself. Parked the car in front of their old house. Derek wanted Julie to follow him inside. Having an unsettled feeling, Julie refused. All of a sudden, Derek grabbed Julie by the arm, and his other hand covered Julie's mouth. You're coming with me, he snarled as he pulled her in. Again, Julie tried her best to escape from Derek's arms, but she couldn't. He dragged her into the house, locked the door and said, You're staying here, and you're not leaving, Derek said coldly. You belong to this family, and you can't just walk away. Julie's heart pounded in her chest. She was trapped. Derek pushed her into a small room, locking her inside. You're not getting out of here until you understand that you can't abandon your family, he said, his voice menacing. Mom would be ashamed of you. As the door slammed shut, Julie felt a wave of despair wash over her. She looked around the room, searching for any means of escape. There was nothing but bare walls and a single window, which was securely locked. She needed to find a way to contact Tony. Hours passed, and Julie tried everything she could think of to get out. She banged on the door, yelled for help, and even tried to force the window open, but it was all in vain. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Tony, who would be coming home soon and finding her gone. Meanwhile, Tony had finished his shift and was driving home, looking forward to a quiet night. But when he arrived at the apartment, he immediately knew something was wrong. The door was ajar, and Julie was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as he searched the apartment, calling her name. Julie, Julie, where are you? His voice echoed through the empty rooms. Realizing she was gone, Tony's mind raced with possibilities. He remembered Derek's volatile nature, and a sense of dread filled him. Without wasting another moment, he grabbed his coat and headed to Derek's house. When Tony arrived, he knocked on the door firmly. Derek answered, his expression feigning confusion. What are you doing here? Where's Julie? Tony demanded, his voice tight with worry. Derek shrugged, his eyes cold. She's not here. Haven't seen her. Just then Tony heard a faint noise coming from inside. His eyes narrowed. I heard something. Let me in, Derek. Derek stepped forward, blocking the doorway. There's no one here, Tony. What do you want? I know Julie is in there. Let her go, Derek. Tony lowered his voice. I said no one is here. Leave, or I call the police. Tony knew something was wrong, but realized he couldn't force his way in without causing more trouble. He backed away, glaring at Derek. I'll be back, he said, turning to leave. As Tony walked down the street, he felt a mix of frustration and fear. He needed a plan. Just as he was about to get into his car, he saw Tiffany, a neighbor, approaching. "Tony, are you looking for Julie?" she asked in concern. "That's right. How do you know?" Tiffany nodded, her expression concerned. "I saw Derek dragging Julie into his house last night. I thought it looked suspicious, so I came back to check. I saw you at the door. I knew it. That bastard," Tony said in anger. "Will you come with me to the police station? I need you to tell them what you saw." Of course, Tiffany agreed. "Let's go." At the police station, Tony and Tiffany spoke with Officer Daniels, who listened carefully to their story. Tiffany provided a detailed account of what she had witnessed, and Tony explained his fears for Julie's safety. "We'll handle it from here," the officer assured them. "We'll need you to come with us, Miss Tiffany, as a witness." At Derek's house, they quickly found Julie locked in a small room. She was pale and shaken, but unharmed. Tears streamed down her face as she saw Tony standing behind the officers. "Tony," she cried, rushing into his arms. "I was so scared." Tony hugged her tightly. "It's okay, Julie. You're safe now." The officers arrested Derek, who glared at Julie with a mix of anger and betrayal. "You'll regret this," he spat as they led him away. Julie clung to Tony, her body trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know if I'd ever get out." Tony stroked her hair gently. "You're safe now, Julie. Derek can't hurt you anymore." As they walked back to the car, Julie glanced at Tiffany, who smiled reassuringly. "Thank you, Tiffany," Julie said softly. "You saved me." Tiffany nodded. "I'm just glad you're okay." That night, as they settled back into Tony's apartment, Julie felt a renewed sense of security. The fear and chaos of the past day had given way to a calm certainty. With Tony by her side, she knew she could face anything. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Julie felt hopeful about the future. After the harrowing ordeal with Derek, Tony and Tiffany had grown closer over the past few months. What began as a friendship had slowly blossomed into something deeper. Tiffany, a single mom with a warm smile and gentle nature, had become a steady presence in their lives. She had been a rock for both Tony and Julie during the difficult times, and her son Elliot had quickly bonded with Julie. One evening, as they all sat together in the living room, Tony took a deep breath and turned to Tiffany. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about our future. Tiffany, will you marry me?" Tiffany's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Yes, Tony, yes." Julie watched them with a smile, feeling a warmth spread through her heart. She had come to love Tiffany and Elliot as part of her own family. The thought of officially becoming a family filled her with hope. As they settled into their new life together, Tony faced new challenges at work. His company was struggling, and he often came home late, exhausted and worried. One evening, after another long day, he sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Tiffany sat down beside him, her hand gently on his shoulder. "We'll get through this, Tony. Together. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Julie and Elliot, standing in the doorway, nodded in agreement. "She's right. We're a family. We'll support you no matter what." Tony looked at them, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you." Despite the financial strain, they found ways to support each other. Tiffany decided to open a small boutique, using her skills and passion for fashion to contribute to the family's income. The shop quickly became popular in the neighborhood, and Tiffany's hard work began to pay off. As the weeks turned into months, things began to look up. Tony's company started to recover, and Tiffany's boutique flourished. The stability they had fought so hard for was finally within reach. One evening, as they all sat together on the couch, Julie looked around at her family. Tony had his arm around Tiffany, and Elliot was nestled between them, watching a movie. Julie felt a warmth spread through her heart, a deep sense of gratitude for the family they had built together. She leaned over and whispered to Tony, "Thank you for everything, for being there for me, for giving me a family. I love you." Tony smiled, his eyes filled with love. "I love you too, Julie. We're a family and we'll always be here for each other." As they sat together watching the movie, Julie felt a sense of contentment she had never known before. She had faced so much pain and loss, but she had found a family who loved her unconditionally. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together as a family. The story follows Yu's journey through hardship and her eventual discovery of hope and belonging. From being thrown out of the house by her brother Derek, Julie finds solace and support from Tony, a kind neighbor, when a tragic accident claims the lives of her mother and grandmother. Tony steps in to adopt Julie, providing her with a safe and loving home. The narrative continues as Tony and Tiffany, the woman who helped rescue Julie from Derek's clutches, begin a relationship and work together to build a new family filled with love and hope. Tony decided to adopt Julie after the death of her mother and grandmother. How do you think this decision impacted the lives of both characters? Derek's character is pivotal in driving the plot and influencing Julie's growth. Do you believe Derek could change if given the right support? Don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments.